Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear ambassadors, distinguished guests. Good morning to our participants from North America. Good evening to our participants from Eastern Europe and the Russian Federation. I welcome you to our third online briefing, together with atomic reporters, in a series of events on current developments in arms control instruments. This time we want to discuss the topic disruptive technologies and strategic stability. We started this series of discussions because the tremendous change in the world bring uncertainties and new challenges that we must face. This applies in particular to the development and use of new technologies. They can do a lot of good, but the development and deployment of disruptive or novel technologies as drones, artificial intelligence, and cyber technologies already have created challenges for strategic stability. The technical deployments are happening at a rapid pace, and there are not many regulatory mechanisms whatsoever that could limit the military use of this technology or its use as a hybrid weapon, let alone exclude it. Let me express a warm thank to our speakers, Dr. Elke Schwarz, Dr. Marina Favaro, and Professor Andrew Futter, who are going to discuss the current developments and their impact on strategic stability. Without further ado, I will pass the floor to Tariq Rauf, who again will be moderating today's event. Tariq is board member of Atomic Reporters and former head of verification and security policy coordination at the International Atomic Energy Agency. Dear Tariq, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Claudia. I too would like to welcome everyone to this interesting discussion that we are going to have today. I would now like to make a few administrative announcements, then introduce the speakers and the topic, and then we will start hearing from our three speakers. So this session is being recorded. It is also going out live on the Facebook and YouTube sites of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Foundation. Atomic Reporters and the KAS will both put it up, the recordings, later on after the event is over. The opinions that are expressed in this discussion are those of the speakers and the participants and do not necessarily represent those of the organizers. So we are discussing, as was mentioned, the impact on strategic stability of disruptive or novel new technologies. To do this, we have assembled an excellent panel of three speakers who have written extensively on various aspects of this particular issue. So first would be Dr. Elke Schwarz. She is senior lecturer in political theory at Queen Mary University in London. Her research focuses on the intersection of ethics and war and ethics of technology, with an emphasis on unmanned and autonomous intelligent military technologies and their impact on the politics of contemporary warfare. She is the author of Death Machines, The Ethics of Violent Technologies, published by Manchester University Press, and is a member of the International Committee for Robot Arms Control. Next will be Marina Favaro. She is a research fellow at the Institute for Peace and Security at the University of Hamburg, where her research focuses on the impact of emerging technologies on arms control. Her research covers space security, forecasting the impact of emerging technologies on arms control, nuclear weapon systems, cybersecurity, and the future of warfare through a variety of methods, including futures and foresight methods, such as horizon scanning, STREAM, which stands for Systemic Technology Reconnaissance Evaluation and Adoption Methodology, Delphi, and Scenario Development. She is the author of Weapons of Mass Destruction. Then we will have Professor Andrew Futter. He is Professor of International Politics at the University of Leicester. He is currently working on the impact of disruptive technology and geopolitical rivalry as part of a 5-year European Research Council coordinator grant, exploring the technological drivers of a third nuclear age. He has authored several books, among them Ballistic Missile Defense and U.S. National Security Policy, the politics of nuclear weapons, reassessing the revolution in military affairs, hacking the bomb, and threats to Euro-Atlantic security. I was already introduced to you by Claudia Crawford of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, so I won't say anything more. So by way of introduction, it is generally believed that the development and deployment of disruptive and novel technologies is creating instabilities, risks and challenges as regards arms race and crisis stability among the major nuclear armed states, as well as other states. Unmanned aerial or autonomous vehicles or systems, UAVs or UASs, such as drones, are being used not only for reconnaissance, but also for aerial attacks on persons, military equipment, and related targets. Artificial intelligence and cyber technologies create further challenges through their capabilities for autonomous automated weapons that can take the human out of the kill decision. While cyber capabilities can and have disrupted nuclear facilities, command and control systems, and critical infrastructure. The combination of these unmanned vehicles or systems, including large-scale autonomous drone swarms with artificial intelligence, creates specific dangers, especially in the context of failed safe versus failed deadly, among other concerns. In addition, hypersonic and nuclear-powered delivery vehicles, missiles, and drones are changing the offense-defense dynamic at the central strategic level through their potential to defeat early warning systems and maneuverability to deliver warheads to designated targets. Related issues concern ambiguity and speed as regards whether a payload is nuclear or not, and the intended target is facing a greatly reduced response time. I might note here that incoming ballistic missile warheads also arrive at targets at hypersonic speed, but in a ballistic rather than in a maneuvering trajectory. These disruptive technologies already have created challenges for strategic stability and have the potential for destabilizing competition in the search for technological dominance. How can the nuclear policy community better prepare for the anticipated knowable and unknowable impacts that these new technologies will have on strategic stability? These and other issues will now be discussed by our three eminent panelists. And the first to speak will be Dr. Elke Schwarz.
Great. Thank you very much for the kind invitation to speak to you this afternoon. And thank you all for coming to the seminar on emerging technologies. This is a very good time to be talking about the issue of disruptive technologies such as military artificial intelligence for weapon systems, as the meeting of the group of governmental experts on lethal autonomous weapon systems at the UN in Geneva is underway as we speak, and a growing number of states are recognizing that the regulation of autonomous systems is a really vital right now and not in some future to come. So it's not really a straightforward task to define exactly what an autonomous weapon system is. As a matter of fact, that is a contentious point in the debates. The ICRC defines autonomous weapons systems as systems with autonomy in their critical function, which means autonomy in selecting, tracking, and attacking targets, the whole kill chain, without any human intervention. For this, artificial intelligence and machine learning is indispensable. So I will focus my very brief comments today on the challenges of military artificial intelligence and machine learning for the military context and for strategic stability as well. So the US and China are presently leading the way in shaping global ambitions for military artificial intelligence use. Russia follows closely in their tracks, along with other military powers such as France, the UK, Israel, and others. Everybody is increasingly investing growing sums and growing measures of hope in military artificial intelligence. One of the primary goals, of course, for AI, for targeting operations, is to make war much faster and consequently more lethal. The assumption is, or the hope is, that AI-enabled systems can calculate contexts faster and much more comprehensively than a human could, and is therefore able to make perhaps better decisions, certainly faster decisions than any human could do in this particular kill chain. Or as Secretary of the US Air Force Frank Kendall was recently quoted as saying, AI can significantly reduce the manpower-intensive task of manually identifying targets, shortening the kill chain, and accelerating the speed of decision-making. So the human's cognitive limitations present an obstacle in this process, more and more so, of course, when the aim is to shorten sensor-to-shooter timelines from 20 minutes to 20 seconds or even shorter. So in practice, then you have a sensor platform that collects data, which tends to also be equipped with a weapon, such as a drone, equipped with a Hellfire missile, which is then connected to an AI system of sorts. The AI system evaluates the sensor data that is collected by the platform, what's happening on the ground, is the target the right target according to certain parameters, and so on, and then makes a recommendation either to an operator that is somewhere in the loop, or the system takes a lethal action autonomously, all that in real time or in a very short span of time. Several projects are underway that develop this kind of technological capability. Project Maven is perhaps the most well-known of these, and we increasingly find or hear reports about how AI targeting algorithms are actually already used in live operational kill chains. About the Turkish Cargo 2 drone, which was allegedly used in Libya in 2020, but the details on these events are quite scant. So there's a distinct sense that things are heating up in this domain, and that the trust in artificial intelligence as a panacea, if you will, for dominance or indeed survival in conflict is gaining a lot of traction. And also the sense that the human is not really equipped to fight in the wars of our future. So it's clear that the goalposts are shifting considerably and quite fast, often justified by invoking a looming arms race or threat by Russia and China taking the lead in the AI domain. So my contention is that this is problematic for a large number of reasons, but I will just very briefly trace two of the reasons why I think this is problematic. So a lot of the debates on lethal autonomous weapon systems or AI-enabled weapon systems is dealing in hypotheticals or suggestions or projections rather, which makes it very difficult to get the hard facts about the benefits or indeed some of the specific risks of the efficacy also of AI-enabled weapon systems. But we can already infer an awful lot about the considerable limitations of AI-enabled autonomous type technologies simply on account of what we know about artificial intelligence and machine learning and how that works for the real world environment. The bottom line is AI is actually not very intelligent when it comes to complex and very open types of environments. In fact, most technology experts would certainly argue that AI-enabled autonomous systems are nowhere near able to operate reliably in highly dynamic and uncertain contexts, let alone able to distinguish between friend and foe in the messy reality of the battlefield. And we also know that systems that employ AI for a full kill chain are likely to be marred by incomplete data, low quality data, incorrect data, inappropriate data, or some sort of discrepant data. This in turn will lead to very brittle systems and in turn to biased and potentially harmful outcomes. Autonomous systems tend to be built and tested on a rather limited sample of data in closed environments. Sometimes synthetic data is used. So it's simply not possible to model and all the complexities of the battlefield accurately. So there's always a risk already implicit in using AI for such complex endeavors. Then the added factor comes in that machine learning actually is not as scientifically robust as it might appear from the media hype often. We know this, for example, from the healthcare sector. AI is very good at dealing with extremely narrow and clearly delineated tasks to be executed in closed systemic environments, and everything else is likely to lead to highly faulty decisions. And that's not even getting to the point of inherent unpredictabilities, the probabilistic nature of AI reasoning, and so on and so forth. Importantly, really, is to stress that this potential for system fog on account of uncertain machine outcomes holds an enormous potential for escalation at a really rapid rate. And so by bracketing the human out increasingly from this accelerated action chain, the checkpoints or check notes for de-escalation shrink considerably. So this escalation risk is quite significant and ought to be taken seriously. And I know I'm running out of time, but I just very briefly want to highlight a second point that concerns me, and that is the AI arms race. Given what we know about the efficacy of AI systems, this prioritizing gaining a foothold or an advantage in the AI arms race strikes me as problematic for, again, a number of reasons. I'm stressing just two. One is whenever you try and win a race, you're not as careful as you ought to be in bringing a product into use. So where states are racing to produce an emerging technology first, the chances are that they're not tested robustly enough, that they're not developed robustly enough. So if you move fast, errors will be made, which perhaps ironically, perhaps not, is of course the Silicon Valley motto, move fast and break things. But for a military context, I would argue that's not a good idea. The second is, of course, whenever we deal with an arms race, there's the risk of greater proliferation. And as we can, of course, see from over a decade of drone warfare, emerging systems extensively rely on components that have dual use, meaning they are produced and used for civilian contexts as much as military operations, which makes them a lot harder to regulate and a lot easier to acquire without stricter oversight or controls. And so as the technology and its system components become cheaper and more easily to acquire, more actors will get in on the game. Again, the drones are case in point. Here, proliferation we have seen has soared by both state and non-state actors. There are other risks, hacking, spoofing, and just all around, of course, always a greater vulnerability with any cyber system that can be less vulnerable, right? So everything networked is essentially quite vulnerable. But it's also useful to look at who's pushing this narrative about, an AI arms race and the risk of falling behind. And here I would just highlight that the driver really is the technology sector. The technology sector has become a bit of an agenda setter. And quite aggressive newcomers to the military market, such as Palantir or Anduril, really want to further strengthen their influence with the Pentagon, but other countries as well, not always with strategic military aims in mind. So for me, this call for an arms race without much strategic foresight raises a couple of questions. What can really realistically be achieved with these new capabilities? It also begs the question, what kinds of wars could there possibly be in which these technologies could yield true or real military benefits and advantages that don't actually transgress IHL or international humanitarian law? There's a tension between faster wars and adherence to humanitarian causes. And perhaps most importantly, can fast accelerated wars conducted with lethal autonomy anywhere in the system, can they be won by anyone? Like, where do we go from there? How do we solve these problems without the problem of war, without the human? And more importantly, how do we create and maintain stability without this important human element? I will leave it here. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Elke. You left us with some very interesting questions and discussion there. So very quickly, including yours. And there are some people who believe that the use of drones in armed combat might be more justifiable because it could be targeted better and in theory could lead to less civilian casualties. What is your view on such thinking?
It depends on where you look, really, right? So it's perspectival. Of course, I can completely understand military organizations who want to minimize the risk to their personnel, and in some very real ways, the argument is valid to say, well, why wouldn't we employ the risk to our own soldiers? And the argument is also made often that through drone technology, you can have better surveillance. And on account of that, perhaps we can distinguish better between who is a civilian or a combatant and who's a non-combatant. Unfortunately, the reality of drone warfare has given us quite good data on the fact that civilians continue to bear the brunt of wars that are fought in which drones are used. And drone technology has also kind of really shown to lower the threshold to resort to force, right? It's an instrument of force. It's not, you can't solve a war with a drone, but you can kind of send it in. Add to that a Hellfire missile has an impact radius, whether it's thrown from a fighter jet or from any other platform, which is quite destructive. On top of that, the question really is, does the algorithmic infrastructure that determines who your target is or what your target is, does that actually work in order to be sufficiently discriminating? And with all of these aspects or elements, there are huge questions. The civilian toll in contemporary wars is enormous. So if we put all of this together, the suggestion is that drone warfare hasn't really limited
picked up from the Brown University Costa War Project and also air wars. And just last month, we had this terrible incident in Kabul where 10 innocent people were killed. And it's sort of interesting that given all this technology, they were chasing a white Toyota Corolla car in Kabul.
Yes.
And any intelligent person would know that Kabul has many hundreds of white Toyota cars. So here we are really looking for a tragedy to happen in this case. So thank you very much, Elke. And let's now move on to Marina Favaro for her interesting presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Tariq. And thank you to the organizers for having me here today. I feel really honored to be speaking alongside Elke and Andrew because I really admire both their work. So I'm glad that Elke teed me up with the arms race with no strategic foresight comment. Because today my remarks will focus on an article that I wrote recently in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, which focused on the role of foresight or strategic foresight in nuclear policy. So our conversation today has focused on the ability for disruptive or novel technologies to create instability, risks, and challenges as regards strategic stability. And many so-called emerging technologies have already emerged to some degree. This is still a future-oriented conversation because in many cases, the specific applications of these technologies aren't yet known. As Elke said, we're working medical. So I argue that emerging technologies, new actors, and the inherent and perhaps even growing complex systems have made it increasingly difficult to anticipate the future simply by extrapolating from the past. And I think the question then becomes, how do we gain insights into the way in which the future strategic environment could be different from today's? And this is obviously a question that's very relevant to us as people who seek to inform policy. As you might expect, this is not a straightforward question. It's, I think, an important one to ask. So one thing that I bring to IFSH is a background in futures methods, which is something that I developed when I was working at RAND Europe. And RAND have been pioneers in this space for decades. They invented and popularized techniques that Tariq mentioned earlier, such as wargaming, Delphi, stream, scenario planning, and these are all still used today in our sector. And in the most broad terms, these methods extrapolate empirical data, and they combine that with assumptions about future developments in order to project plausible futures. But one challenge that's specific to using these types of techniques in the nuclear policy space is that we struggle with a real lack of empirical data. And this is because the historical record does not include many nuclear wars. But one critical feature of these methods is that they generate the data that they then seek to use to extrapolate about the future. So this often relies on participation from a range of stakeholders, and it could comprise simulated emergency situations like in wargaming, or iterating through multiple rounds of questionnaires, as is the case with Delphi, or a technology scoring exercise, which is the case with Stream. But I guess I say all this in hope that I can kind of dispel this notion that practitioners of futures methods are gazing into crystal ball. Instead, we're talking about futures in the plural, because the objective is not to predict a single future, but to explore alternative futures. And by envisioning these alternative futures, we can better sense and shape and adapt to the one that's currently emerging, which in turn we hope help improve policy, planning, and decision-making. And there's loads of historical examples of foresight in action, some of which are nuclear focused. So RAND famously used scenario development to predict the Soviet Union's nuclear strategy during the Cold War, but scenarios were also used at Royal Dutch Shell over the course of the 1970s, which helped them to prepare for the oil crises and economic turmoil that decade brought. But also in Singapore, the government's foresight practice has helped them to manage risk and uncertainty for the past 40 years. So crucially, these are not examples of times when analysts have successfully predicted what the future might hold, but instead they're long-term projects that focus on going beyond the prevailing assumptions of the present. And I think, whereas there used to be a close relationship between foresight and nuclear weapons, this mostly ended with the Cold War. And I think that although nuclear risks are arguably rising today, there are only a small subgroup of the nuclear policy community who continue to use these types of methods for analytical purposes. And this is not the case in other sectors, which continue to use strategic foresight as part of their decision-making process. So to give you a few examples of people who are using these methods today, analysts like Andrew Reddy from UC Berkeley use war games to help us deal with the intersection of cyber and nuclear conflict. Chris Spedding, who works at BASIC, is using the Delphi method to assess the impact of emerging maritime technologies on nuclear risk. And my own research uses the STREAM method to evaluate the impact of emerging technologies on strategic stability. And this is something that I'm happy to kind of discuss more in the Q&A if people are interested. But I guess my overarching point here is that, you know, these projects are a step in the right direction, but these efforts are quite scattered, and there's an absence of long-term thinking on strategic stability that in nuclear policy, which I think is an issue that we want to be addressing. I don't want to simply evangelize on futures methods. I don't think that they are the silver bullet for this sector necessarily. So I do want to kind of explore briefly some of the limitations of these methods. And I think first, there's limits to the extent to which empirical data about the past and present can be measured, obtained, and used to forecast future change. Second, the system or processes under consideration can behave in different ways as the future is very uncertain and unpredictable. Third, many relationships that have developed in a linear way in the past don't continue to do so into the future. And fourth, the future is unknown. So different and conflicting perspectives as to how the future may unfold may also be legitimate. But I think that notwithstanding these limitations, futures methods do provide us with the tools to address the challenge of new technologies and nuclear risk. And they also give us a good dose of humility about how much we can control our world and the future, which I think is probably helpful for policymakers and scholars in this space. So that's all from me for now. I can drop the article, the bulletin article that I wrote in the chat if anyone's interested in reading it afterwards, and I'm interested in continuing the conversation with you all.
Well, thank you very much, Marina. This was a very interesting presentation, bringing forward this discussion on strategic foresight and forecasting how to deal with these emerging technologies. So in one of your recommendations in your paper was that there should be a bridge building exercise between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states with regard to the impact of these new technologies. So my question to you relates to, we are not dealing with a level playing field. So the nuclear weapon states are way more advanced in these technologies, as are maybe some of their allies from the NATO countries, not all of them, but some of them. And then there is a vast number of countries from the non-aligned and other countries that are part of this overall dialogue between weapon states and non-weapon states. So how can one level the playing field so that those that don't have familiarity with these technologies, or even the forecasting methods that you mentioned, STREAM, Delphi, and so on, how can this bridge building actually take place?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think as it pertains to technologies, leveling the playing fields, I don't know how we do that without mass proliferation of these technologies, which I don't know is necessarily a recommendation that I would put forward. I guess the question is it more important to have that everyone has these technologies, and will that create more stability? I don't know that it necessarily would, but I think as regards these methods and what they can bring, I would love to see more scholarship programs that enable people from countries that don't have access to these methods. And I think, well, I'll make a brief caveat here and say that I've kind of tried to emphasize that even in countries like the UK, where I'm speaking to you from, these methods aren't widely used in all sectors. But I think that there could be training programs and scholarships that were available to make sure that more people have these skills and work on kind of a knowledge transfer program to ensure that people around the world can also be using similar methods to anticipate the future and bring about, a preferred future, because that's part of what futures is as well, as it's thinking about what is the future that we want to get to and what are the steps that we need to take now in order to get there. And I think that's a really valuable exercise that we could be doing, as an international community more often.
Good. So later on, we'll talk a little bit more about, you shortlisted these 10 technologies into 4 technology clusters in your paper. You also talked about machine learning, and we can explore that a little bit further later on and see where that leads us. So now we come to Professor Andrew Putter. Andrew, I was wondering if you might also say a few words about what is the third nuclear age, in addition to your other comments. Thanks.
Thanks, Tarek, and thanks so much to the organisers for inviting me to speak today, and of course thanks to my 2 excellent co-panellists for kicking us off in such a brilliant way. Tarek, I'll perhaps mention the third nuclear aid aspect right at the end of this, because it kind of links in like that. But I was asked by the organisers to speak today about the challenges that might be posed by the emergence, or I think perhaps more correctly, re-emergence of certain types of strategic delivery systems. And I suppose this arguably represents the least novel of the types of technologies we're looking at here, but are nevertheless important, and particularly when we take these technologies together as force multipliers and think of it as a context, not just as individual capabilities. So what I thought I would do in this short bit of time today is to speak about hypersonic weapons, nuclear-powered missiles, and nuclear-armed drones. All of these are under development and in some cases may have been deployed by current nuclear-armed states. So perhaps the technology most closely associated with the hype around challenges to strategic stability at the moment are hypersonic weapons. Hypersonic refers to the speed at which something is traveling, in this case, speeds in excess of 5,000 kilometers an hour, around 4 times the speed of sound. But the label has also come to be associated with a particular class of weaponry, of which hypersonic glide vehicles and hypersonic cruise missiles are the best current examples. These 2 things are slightly different. A hypersonic glide vehicle is boosted into the atmosphere, usually by a rocket, in a similar way as a ballistic missile. They glide for a certain period of time before falling back to Earth to hit their targets. A hypersonic cruise missile is powered by a scramjet air-breathing engine and stays inside the atmosphere. It's powered through its entire flight, as opposed to the glide vehicle, which, you guessed it from the name, glides. Both HGVs and HCMs follow a different trajectory to normal ballistic missiles, flying just above or below the atmosphere, as opposed to the curve that we associate with ballistic flight. They are designed to be maneuverable during the mid-course of flight and potentially guided terminally towards their targets as well. And the fear is that the combination of speed, surprise, accuracy, and maneuverability will reduce warning times, potentially be better at defeating mid-course defenses, and therefore maybe make hypersonic missiles suitable for carrying out surprise disarming strikes. There is also a fear, I think alluded to at the start of this session, around the ambiguity of warhead, target, and destination when it comes to these capabilities as well, and the fact that these may well lead to instability. However, and while I definitely wouldn't want to sound complacent, I think some of the challenges posed by hypersonic weapons to strategic stability have perhaps been hyped or misunderstood. This is not, I'm not the first person to say this. There's lots of brilliant scholarship out there saying it, but it still seems to be slightly lost in the debate. And there are a number of reasons for this. So first of all, current ballistic missiles can travel at similar speeds to hypersonic missiles, in some cases possibly quicker, and can be launched on depressed trajectories so that they don't have to go like this. They can be much more depressed. Second, both ballistic and cruise missiles can be guided, particularly in the case of cruise missiles, albeit of course they are slower than a hypersonic cruise missile, and they can also contain mechanisms and countermeasures to defeat mid-course defenses and indeed other defenses as well. Hypersonic glide vehicles slow down when falling back to Earth as soon as the boost phase finishes, and as soon as they maneuver, they begin losing speed. And this means that they may be more susceptible to terminal missile defenses than traditional ballistic missiles. And fourth, both glide vehicles and hypersonic cruise missiles produce quite a lot more heat because of the types of flight path they have than normal cruise or ballistic missiles, which theoretically makes them easier to track with infrared sensors, which may mean that's the way of shooting them down with different types of future missile defense systems. And I think importantly, the US, Russia, China, and many others are developing these systems, but for quite different reasons. So these range from strategic applications such as defeating a ground-based mid-course defense or a national missile defense system to much more tactical applications, and also importantly range in terms of nuclear and non-nuclear applications too. And I think this suggests that the hypersonic challenge to strategic stability may not therefore be as acute as is sometimes portrayed. We may already be living with a lot of the complications that they produce, but we can come back to that in Q&A. The second delivery system I wanted to speak about today is the return of nuclear-powered missiles. So despite the interest in the Russian so-called Skyfall missile after it was unveiled a few years ago, the idea of using nuclear propulsion for strategic delivery systems is far from new. And in fact, the US had a program for a nuclear-powered nuclear-armed missile in the 1960s called Project Pluto. The idea behind Project Pluto was to develop a supersonic low-altitude missile, or SLAM, using nuclear-powered ramjets. The idea would be that after being launched by a rocket booster, this would, in theory, have given the missile enormous range and the ability to hit targets anywhere in the world. So you can see how it would have been very attractive at the time. However, even back in the early 1960s, Pluto was the Project Pluto, and the idea of nuclear-powered delivery vehicles was seen as being unworkable, partly because of the advent of cheaper, quicker, lighter, chemically fueled long-range ballistic missiles, but also, I think, particularly because of the concern about the radiation that would be produced by the unshielded reactor that would have been used on these types of missiles, particularly as it would travel fairly low inside the atmosphere. So I think the current interest in nuclear-powered missiles probably comes from two things. Again, just to reiterate, nuclear propulsion theoretically allows for limitless range and endurance of nuclear-armed delivery systems, something that just isn't possible with other types that we currently have, and therefore also the ability to target attacks from different directions. So, for example, by flying over the South Pole as opposed to flying over the North Pole, and therefore circumventing a lot of radar and other sensors which are focused northwards. We think about the US and Russia, but also China, but would actually come in from the south. And second, there's the possibility, and this links into some of the things that Elke mentioned, that the same characteristics would make nuclear-powered delivery systems potentially able to loiter or be in a certain area for much, much longer periods of time, although there'd be problems about how vulnerable they would be to compromise. But in terms of the impact on strategic stability, again, it's not clear in my mind that any of the original limitations have really changed today. Skyfall, as far as I'm aware, would probably be too big to be delivered by an aircraft, so it would need to be launched from a large sea or land-based platform. Assuming that the reactor is not fully shielded, this would mean all the radiation problems that happened back in the 1960s. And it's possible, although I think there's some debate around this, whether a radiation accident in a Russian test range in August 2019 could have been linked to this, trying to solve this problem of how to deal with radiation as part of this missile. Interestingly, and despite some statements by then President Donald Trump, neither the US or any other state appears to be interested in developing or redeveloping this capability, as far as I'm aware. So it may be that the impact of this is primarily political, symbolic, rather than something that will be applied soon or deployed soon. And the final type of delivery system that I wanted to mention is the possibility of deploying nuclear weapons on autonomous platforms, such as drones or other unpiloted vehicles, again, linking into some of the things that Elke mentioned at the start. And again, the best example here would be the Russian so-called Status 6 Poseidon program, which again has been very much in the news over the past few years. So this would be, or this is intended to be, a nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed torpedo capable of operating over intercontinental ranges with a degree of autonomy. Again, we're not sure exactly how much, once launched from a submarine ship or other submerged platform. This, as far as we're aware, is a pretty substantial piece of machinery. It's 2 meters in diameter, around about 24 meters long, could travel up to at speeds of potentially over 50 knots, so a pretty substantial capability. And of course, as with a nuclear-armed missile, the reactor means that it would be capable of very, very long ranges and endurance, and it may also incorporate different stealth technologies, making it very difficult to find and track underwater. So the Status 6 was announced at a similar time as, or perhaps we became aware of it slightly before, but was announced at a similar time as Russia's other new strategic weapon systems. And as with the other capabilities mentioned by me earlier in this talk, is clearly linked with a perceived need to overcome US ballistic missile defenses and to counter other technologies with potential strategic applications as well. The idea appears to be that the Status 6 would be launched from long distance, stealthily make its way to its target, perhaps a coastal area or naval battle group, for using its large megaton nuclear blast to create a tidal wave and spread radiation. Interestingly, this again goes back to ideas that have been around since the 1950s and 1960s about having very large warheads aboard torpedoes and using it in this particular way. So as Elke said, the Status 6 Poseidon program taps into, I think, much broader concerns about autonomous nuclear delivery platforms. And while we don't know quite how autonomous or how much AI would be involved in this particular system, it is something that is clearly on the agenda and on the horizon. It is something that is becoming probably more and more possible, whether or not this actually happens and is deployed. And as far as I'm aware, while no other states are interested in developing nuclear weapons without humans in control, this is something that we do have to guard against, because it will at some point become a possibility for some of the reasons that that my two co-panelists have mentioned before. Interestingly, as far as I'm aware, and again, people in the audience, if they know differently, please push back, but the US Air Force has said that the B-21 Raider, the new bomber that's coming online, will be manned or will be inhabited for nuclear missions, albeit it may be possible that it's uninhabited for other missions, as far as I'm aware. So in summary, while there's much hype about new delivery systems, it's not clear to me that hypersonic missiles, nuclear-powered missiles, or nuclear-armed drones currently, I think that's important to stress that word, currently undermine strategic stability between the major powers. In fact, in some applications, they may well reinforce or enhance deterrence through mutual vulnerability. But this is definitely not to say that their development and deployment won't impact nuclear risks and potentially drive arms racing. And it seems to me, and this I think links into the third nuclear age idea that you would like me to mention, Tarek, that the risks posed by these types of delivery systems become much more pronounced when we combine it with other technological shifts and other new capabilities across the sort of nuclear ecosystem. And it's probably what we're thinking, or what I'm trying to argue in some of my work and some of my projects at the moment, is that we may be on the cusp of a shift in the global nuclear order and the way that we understand nuclear risks. Now, I don't necessarily think that these delivery systems are the main part of that, but they are, if you like, symptomatic, or they are part of a much broader thing that is going on that's transforming the nature of nuclear risks, the way crises may escalate, the way we think about deterrence, how we understand stability, and a whole host of other things as well. So I guess the third nuclear age idea is about saying we've had concepts of where the main threats in nuclear order lie. In the first nuclear age, it's the Cold War, it's major war between the superpowers. In the second nuclear age, it's nuclear use in the regions or by rogue or other actors. And in the third nuclear age, it might be much more about this intersection of new technologies, of different types of capabilities, nuclear and non-nuclear, kinetic and non-kinetic, and a return of great power politics and these things coming together. So I'd be more than happy to explain that a bit more in Q&A, but I guess I better not use up too much time. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. I think that was a brilliant description. I sometimes argue that, well, you already mentioned that nuclear-powered missiles are not new, as hypersonic missiles are also not new. They were also tested in the 60s and so on. And as you mentioned, other propellant systems became easier to use and cheaper and so on. But I tend to argue that the antecedents of all of this go back to the Strategic Defense Initiative of Ronald Reagan in 1980 that partly led to the collapse of the Reykjavik summit and the two leaders, Gorbachev and Reagan, not to agree to eliminate nuclear weapons. And as you remember, Strategic Defense Initiative talked about laser weapons. It talked about brilliant pebbles in space to take out satellites and even incoming warheads. And then with President Bush, George W. Bush, we have this prompt global strike to deliver a warhead anywhere in the world within 1 hour. And in a sense, that sort of fueled some of these development systems, but it also fueled the reaction from the Russian side. which felt that they were becoming more vulnerable. And I'll quote you from Anatoly Antonov, the current Russian ambassador in Washington, but also the negotiator of the New START Treaty, along with Rose Gottmuller. And he said these new technologies, prompt global strike, when combined with global missile defense, becomes a means of seeking to dominate the world politically and strategically, and thus undermine Russia's deterrent. So I think that when President Putin announced all these new technologies that you mentioned, this was their way of trying to push back against what they thought was the American technological lead. And now we have both sides developing, or three countries developing these technologies. So I would sort of quibble with one of your comments where you said you didn't think that these were strategically destabilizing, if that's really what you meant to say.
No, I think that's a really good point. I think part of the reason some of these weapon systems that I spoke about were unveiled is almost as a call to arms control, right? To try and well, definitely since SDI, Russia has been interested in finding ways of limiting US missile defense, right? And it's become more acute in the last 20 years with the end of the ABM treaty, the deployment of various different systems, and that has never really gone away. And I think this, the announcement of some of these systems is a gambit to try and push the US policymakers, and perhaps most importantly the US Senate, into considering what role limitations on BMD could play in any future arms control agreement. So I think that's really important. I think the fascinating thing with BMD for me is increasingly the concern is not just the type of kinetic interceptors that we've seen being deployed, and indeed even that link back to some extent to so-called Star Wars and SDI, this right of launch infrastructure of radars, interceptors, etc. But it's the left of launch aspects. And one of the things we didn't really talk about today is cyber capabilities or computer network operations. And the idea with left of launch missile defense is that you infiltrate adversary systems, you stop them working, you mess around so that missiles fail, etc., and you have this full spectrum missile defense. And I actually think that's an even bigger concern, and I think it's in the back of policymakers' minds in Russia, in China, and a number of other countries for a number of very good reasons. So I think you're right that some of these systems will have strategic applications and may lead into causing instability, but I don't see them as being the main drivers of it. I think there are other things that are going on around this that I'm actually more worried about, in a sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so before we come back to Elke and Marina, one other point. You've already mentioned left of launch and right of launch. These concepts are not very well understood by many people, so could you just give a capsule definition of what is left of launch and what is right of launch?
So the idea of right of launch missile defense is to try and intercept or shoot down a missile after it's been launched, so right of launch. And traditionally, the idea is to do this through a nuclear blast, kinetic interception, blast fragments, or in certain ways, or possibly by using directed energy weapons. There's a lot of different ways of doing it. But the point is, it's after it's happened, so you are responding to a launch. Left of launch is about trying to stop that happening, right? It's about trying to find ways of either kinetically destroying launchers or command and control nodes through, as you mentioned, precision strike operations, or it's about cyber and electronic warfare and about interfering in systems so they don't work. So it's left is kind of before launch, right is after launch.
Yeah, so in a sense, left of launch is you're trying to prevent the thing from being launched in the first place, interfering in different ways, or even a preemptive strike. And as you mentioned, right of launch is once it's been launched to try and destroy the incoming warhead. Let's try and sort of...
Sorry, as somebody once said to me, the best way of thinking of left of launch is basically as preemption by any other name.
Yeah, good, thanks. So let's try and bring all of three of you together in a sense. Coming back to Elke, you mentioned artificial intelligence, and this seems to be critical to the development of autonomous weapon systems. And we see more progress at the moment being made in the civilian sector with self-driving cars and other stuff that people are using to control their homes from outside. And it seems that the military is looking at these technologies with a lot of interest to see if they could have self-driving tanks or self-operating robots in the battlefield, and therefore not risk quote unquote humans, but like H.G. Wells have a battle of robots or machines. Is that sort of capturing the discussion in a wide sense?
Well, the discussion is manifold, actually, and it's quite interesting. And it's also really frustrating because there's a lot of hype around artificial intelligence. And this hype serves, of course, a number of purposes. I come back to the technology sector. So, of course, the military and the private sector have always been kind of entwined, but the private sector is really driving a lot of the agenda, it seems, on wanting or on creating a narrative by which the best possible outcome is to have a fully networked AI ready, everything is connected to the system sort of reality. And again, so Eric Schmidt, former CEO of Google, has been on a, I think it's now a 3 or 4 year campaign to kind of, as a Pentagon advisor, as a government advisor, kind of drive this agenda forward. So what is produced in the private sector is intended in some ways for the military sector. Now, there are so many different types of artificial intelligence we mustn't forget as well, right? So I mentioned already, AI is really good at very narrow tasks. We already see with self-driving cars that there are huge problems, right? So, the idea that Elon Musk had put forward that at the end of this year, no, at the end of last year, we'd all be driving around in self-driving taxis hasn't materialized. It hasn't materialized for a reason, because a lot of the systems are flawed when they work when they put to work in real world environments where light conditions are always the same, aren't always the same, where cloud cover can obscure important features of the AI system. Training data isn't always available. So for real world applications of artificial intelligence, the way it ought to be, or the way people would like to see it in the military, we're nowhere near close. Now, that's not to say that artificial intelligence wouldn't be enormously useful for, I don't know, predictive maintenance or some, supply chain management within military operations. But that's, of course, the often very boring stuff that people are not so interested in. People want to hear about self-driving tanks and so on and so forth. But we don't have the capability at this point. And again, a lot of technologists would say not for a long time would we have the capability to use AI in a way that would allow us to use, self-driving tanks or fully autonomous weapon systems reliably and without causing any harm.
So, the US Navy is developing this autonomous ship called the Sea Hunter. You have the Israeli loitering munitions, Harpy or Harop. Also, the Aegis anti-air missile defense can also be put on automatic, where potentially it could shoot down an airliner like the Malaysian airliner was shot down over Ukraine some years ago. So some of these systems are already in place in some way, and to what extent the human is there or not there, and as you said, the kill decision is this question mark. And this is, I think, what policymakers and also people in civil society are increasingly worried about. And to pick up a point that Andrew was making about this Poseidon nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed autonomous torpedo, which will apparently have a warhead up to 2 megatons. And there's also some thinking about containerizing it and putting it on the seabed, where it could operate like a dead hand, that, if the Russian command feels that they've been defeated, or this could be given an order to fire off. So what are the concerns here with regard to command and control, and some of the points that Marina was making about strategic foresight and enabling policymakers just to even think about asking the right questions?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's a great prompt, because I am often a little bit frustrated depending on which debates I enter into, or who I talk to in the debates on military artificial intelligence. Because very often the focus is on AI capabilities in an extremely technical sense, right? So whether that is the Skyborg program or the Valkyrie drone, it's about making it happen. It's about the technological capabilities, but without really thinking further about what is it for, right? This is why I kind of left with a unanswerable question: what kinds of wars can we fight, and can these wars actually be won? And I kind of come back here to something that actually the father of cybernetics, Norbert Wiener, who was active, he was working with the military early on, but as autonomy in weapon systems was developing, he was growing increasingly concerned about an enormous preoccupation with figuring out how to do things, but not why to do things, right? So he said, he calls it this privileging of know how over know what for, or over knowing what for. And I feel we are in a moment as well at this juncture where this desire to innovate and produce things because we can takes over, or has priority over a better and conceptual understanding of how wars can be won and what these weapons can do to limit warfare. I mean, the idea should be for liberal nations not to engage in more war, but less war, technically speaking. So there's a myopic perspective sometimes that focuses on just innovation for innovation's sake, but not really with a whole lot of strategic planning. And in some ways, that is reflected in the recent wars that the US, but other coalition forces have also fought. And I think here about Afghanistan, right? So there's a lot of tactical moves made, but strategically not really well organized, if you will. And so certainly something I think to take a step back and kind of consider what
if I could intervene, apparently in the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia, the Azeris used drones to basically decimate Armenian tanks and air defense systems. And I sort of show some videos of that.
Yeah.
So where, they're using, first of all, they blind the radars and so on, so they cannot detect the attacking drone or platform. And then they can pick them off with a single shot. And so if that's the future of warfare, coming a little bit like video games, then we are looking at both very costly systems, but also a lot of danger in terms of how to control this.
Yes, certainly. And I think the question of do such systems, and especially distancing systems and remotely controlled systems, lead to a lower threshold in the resort to use violence, that's a big issue, right? So if it becomes more available to a larger number of states to address their grievances with these types of technologies, which are much harder to control in terms of proliferation, then we're destabilizing everything essentially. So there is an issue there to be considered. Now this is drones, and we're dealing here with an imbalance in who had which drone technology, but this is not always the same situation as we've seen with Armenia and Azerbaijan.
Okay, so coming back to
can I jump in on your last comment as well? Because I think it was really interesting, and I speak. This is obviously more Elke's, remit, but I think you brought up the Aegis system, which has been in effect since the 1980s, and I think that it's a good reminder that we don't need to wait for automation or increased automation or AI-enabled capabilities doing whatever in order to have concerns about what the impact might be on humanitarian law and meaningful human control, because these systems that have automated functions where the human is in the loop and they're just pressing go on an output that the computer gives to them, there's a lot of automation bias in those that's been shown over the years, which is when humans just, concede to the computer and assume that whatever process it took to get to that outcome was way better than anything my stupid human brain could have done. And so I think that's a huge concern. And there's one report that I'm thinking of called Meaningless Human Control, which is written or published this year or last year, I can't remember, 2020 or 2021. And that talks about this automation and autonomy divide, which I think is a really important one to emphasize, that these aren't new debates. I mean, that's exactly Andrew's point as well, but these aren't new questions that we're having to deal with. If new capabilities are to arise, these are the same questions that we've been having to deal with for quite a while. Yeah.
So in one of his writings, Andrew has pointed out the experience of this Russian Soviet officer, Stanislav Petrov, on whom there's even now a movie, The Man Who Saved the World. And there have been other instances, for example, former US Defense Secretary talks about 3 instances where he was woken up where the radars or the warning systems were telling that incoming Soviet missiles were there, and they proved to be false. And then there's this famous incident of the rising moon and seagulls being misidentified as incoming missiles. So Andrew, with these much faster delivery systems, isn't decision time being compressed? I mean, at the moment, the American and Russian presidents have maybe 15 minutes or so to make the decision. But if we have these hypersonic things, isn't this getting compressed to 2 or 3 minutes and then increasing concomitant dangers?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I would focus less on the hypersonic aspect of it, to be honest, because you could still forward deploy missiles and attack something quite quickly without hypersonic weapons and in other ways. But I think you're absolutely right that decision-making time and good information to base decisions on is probably being reduced. And we've moved, I think, from a world where it was difficult to get enough information to make decisions to one where there's simply too much. And it's hard to know what's right, what's wrong. There's too many things coming at you from lots of different directions. And there's been some brilliant work on sort of the importance of things like social media and everything else, about how perceptions, how signaling is done, and all things around that, which just make managing crises that much more difficult, and I think decrease the time available to decision makers to do it. The other example I would give that feeds on to the ones you gave is 30 years ago, NORAD had, as you said, there's this list of various different near misses or computer malfunctions of seeing various things in the sky and whatever else. There's also an example of a faulty computer chip, and another example of loading the wrong training tape, I think it was. And I think they're quite instructive, those examples, because these were the big machines that had floppy disks that you put in and that were used for various parts of within the command and control network. And as far as I'm aware, they're being replaced, and for good reasons. They're quite old. It's hard to keep up, to store all the technology you need to service it, but they're being replaced by more complex systems that are less easy to understand. It's less obvious when things have gone wrong. It's less obvious if something has been tampered with. So you have a combination of less time because of the environment that's going on, to a lesser extent because of new types of weapons or kinetic weapons. But this system that is becoming more complex, and perhaps we're getting further away from understanding decisions that are made. And this feeds into points that both Elke and Marina made, that the more sophisticated you make these things, the less aware you are sometimes about how decisions are made and all things like that. So I would be concerned that you have this reduction in decision-making time twinned with a real desire to modernize, digitize, increase complexity and functionality within and around nuclear command and control, and indeed command and control of forces more broadly, of which nuclear is now increasingly part of. And that all of this is making decision-making time less, more difficult, and that it's an overwhelming, so it's being overwhelmed by information and not knowing what's right, that really is quite worrying.
Mm-hmm. So Marina, I was looking into your paper and the stream technology, which apparently is used more in business and marketing, and you were using it for strategic foresight. So given some of the problems that both Elke and Andrew have discussed, how do these technologies help a decision maker or a policy maker with strategic foresight? To conceptualize and understand the problem, and then to find a way of addressing the problem with the solution.
Yeah, that's a great question. Just taking, don't forget both your points. Yeah, so I guess for those who aren't familiar with the research that I do, as I mentioned, I use this round developed method called STREAM, in order to basically assess and prioritize different technologies. STREAM has kind of two axes. So you're looking at the potential impact of a given technology if it were to come to fruition, or technology or deployment or whatever, and then the barriers that may stand in the way of it coming to fruition, with the idea that if you put these two axes together, you get one which is highly impactful and highly feasible to implement. And those are the technologies that are going to be your most concerning ones. But also it's kind of that's the most basic way of thinking about STREAM. I actually use machine learning in my research this time to do a more multidimensional analysis and get clusters of technologies, as Tariq said, that were scored similarly across similar criteria. So the idea is, instead of just taking all the impact and all the implementation scores for a given technology and taking the average of those, which kind of completely whitewashes the differences in the way that they're scored. This preserves more nuance in the scores and gives you a more interesting kind of meaningful cluster of technologies that you can pull characteristics from and pull and potentially, you know, even fall or kind of decide on some risk reduction measures that could address that cluster. So that kind of addresses Tariq's question, which is that what I've done in this research is basically created a conceptual framework for policymakers that takes a very confusing ecosystem to look at. We've got, you know, all the factors that we've been talking about that make it very difficult for a policymaker to look at all these emerging technologies and see them not just as this monolithic risk category, or indeed seeing them only through these kind of individual cases like hypersonic, and then trying to extrapolate what to do from that one specific into the general. So this is kind of a middle ground. It's doing some grouping together, but hopefully it's doing that based on a kind of robust expert assessment, as opposed to, I don't know, ignorance really. And so that's the kind of framework that I've put forward, is these technology clusters. And one of them is actually called the compressed cluster, which were characterized by experts as capable of compressing timelines and forcing these quick decisions. And hypersonics, one of those. We also have cyber operations, both defensive and offensive, which are obviously relevant to left of launch, and kinetic anti-satellite weapons, swarm robotics, and rendezvous and proximity operations in space. So these are obviously very diverse technologies from across operating domains, but the stream approach has essentially allowed us to group them and say these have similar characteristics. And so we can start to be thinking about what the risk reduction recommendations might be for a group of technologies that have a similar risk profile. That's essentially
so
what.
How does deep fake technology fit into this? Because you also include it among your 10 technologies.
Yeah, so deep fake technology and satellite jamming and spoofing systems create their own little cluster. And that's actually the most highly impactful and most feasible to implement in the next 10 years as assessed by experts. So that cluster, the distort cluster, which is after which I named my report Weapons of Mass Distortion, that's kind of the most concerning in the eyes of these experts, because they're so easy to implement. Like, you know, any smartphone user can create and disseminate seemingly authentic deepfake videos in seconds. Satellite jammers, and spoofing systems, you can plug straight into, you know, those vintage kind of car cigarette lighting spots. You can plug them straight into there, and use that to drive your company car around and not be detected, and take it on holiday and whatever. And so these are used for many innocent purposes, but also there is this dual use potential for it to fall into the hands of malicious actors and potentially be used for different purposes. And then that kind of underscores the importance of bridge building between private and public sector, as we were talking about earlier, because we really need to make sure that there's this kind of literacy in the public sector is able to communicate to the private sector what the potential security implications of these technologies.
Mm-hmm. So apparently there already is one incident of a deep fake technology creating a problem between two countries, and there were some reports that a deep fake technology was used to make up a statement by the Pakistani Prime Minister against a Saudi royal family member, and that sort of created some turbulence between the two countries, which took a few months to resolve, and then it was determined that such a statement actually had not been made and somebody had used the fake technology to create it. Coming back to you, Elke, I mentioned about this issue about civilian casualties. Way back during the Second World War, the head of the US Air Force in the Pacific Theater was General Curtis LeMay, and he infamously said there are no innocent civilians in war, because everyone is contributing to the war effort in one way or another, feeding the troops, attending the sick, providing the cannon fodder, and so on. So I came across a couple of data points. Some of these are sort of critical of the US, and this report in The Guardian said that in the previous 20 years, since September 2001, the US conducted more than 91,000 drone and airstrikes, which led to at least 22,000 civilians being killed, and the high number is about 48,000. And then the Cost of War project at the Watson Institute of Brown University said that in all, in these past 20 years, more than 360,000 civilians were killed, if one includes all civilians killed by all sides to the conflict. Now, of course, not all of these poor civilians who were killed as a result of smart or autonomous weapons, but a significant number of them were. And apparently, other than civil society, the military establishments do not really count civilian casualties. They only count their own. And since you are also contributing to the civil society effort to make this more accountable, for policymakers and for civil society people who are not well aware of this, how would you educate them and tell them to how to understand these issues, for example?
Yes, it's actually a philosophical question that is continually debated as to who's innocent in war and who's not innocent in war. And that is a larger question. But to come back to the quite practical and empirical dimensions here, what we have seen with drone warfare was quite interesting in that the counting, who counts, has shifted quite significantly. Obama, I think at some point acknowledged just over 100 civilian deaths, when data that we have from other institutions that have worked with people on the ground, and such as the Bureau of Investigative Journalism and others that you have just mentioned, have quite different data. Then you have the issue of, there was this great report in the New York Times that highlighted the fact that all military-aged males are counting as combatants, right? So who is counted? How are they counted? What are the parameters? That matters. That matters even more when we feed that into an algorithmic system. But how do you identify who is a viable target? And that can become necessarily quite expansive. So you have two things going on. You have an expanding target list, if you will. We saw that with especially signature strikes in drone warfare. And you have a limitation as to what is being counted and taken seriously as true collateral damage or civilian deaths. And it's not just deaths, right? It's also civilian harms and other ways, psychological harms, disruption of political communities, all that kind of stuff. So looking at where these technologies and how they are deployed is really important, and understanding what impact they have, because some might argue that the drone warfare in essence has a counterproductive effect, right? So by going in, taking out an entire family because you think one person is the bad guy, essentially, will produce more challenges to you as an actor. So we've seen, you mentioned the example in Kabul with the aid worker, I think he was. And it's interesting, when we don't know much about this event, right? So we don't really know where the intelligence came from that this was a appropriate target, or that he was liable to be killed. But leaving that aside, the car was bombed, and there were 7 children in the car. 7 children died in this strike. That's enormous. That's an enormous civilian toll for even just one high-value individual, right? So there's a kind of like a playing fast and loose with who is being targeted and how, and systems seem to help in obscuring that to the point where it becomes a lot harder to hold militaries or certain operations accountable for what has happened on the ground.
I think that strike also came soon after the bomb that was exploded on the outskirts of Kabul airport. So already tensions were high. 13 Americans and 70 Afghans were killed in that thing. So there was, I think, also some thirst for revenge as the troops were finally pulling out. And so some people might say, well, if it had been automated, that this emotional part wouldn't have been there. We have about 10 more minutes left. I've been looking in the chat function for questions when I haven't been seeing any. That's why we carried on this discussion. At this point, maybe if the three of you would like to ask each other something, I will give you that opportunity, because I think that would also be an interesting part of our discussion here. Andrew, go ahead.
Thanks. There's probably a digital way of doing that, but I thought it probably easier.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I've got lots of questions, but just one to Marina that I think is a really, really important one, and it feeds in with quite a lot of work that's going on at the moment. And it's about, you said something, and sorry if I've got this wrong, but you said something about how we need to be able to accept that the future might not progress in a linear way from the past, and we shouldn't rely on past experiences of guiding what comes in the future. And I think that's absolutely right. And it links in with some work that people like Benoit Pelopillez have done about imagining different nuclear futures and how we understand our nuclear past and how we build it up and things like that. And that's just in the nuclear realm. But how do we do that? Because I think it's natural for us all as humans to kind of assume that and to extrapolate from past experience and have that as the norm. Maybe that's the safe way of understanding the future. So I'm guessing, and I know I've had a little bit of engagement with some of the excellent things you're doing, that the idea is to challenge this, but how do we do that? How do we change that in, I guess, particularly policymakers' minds, or can we?
Yeah, it's interesting. Oh, go ahead,
Marina. No, go ahead. I'd like you guys to engage.
I think that's a really great question. I think also something that you kind of mentioned on maybe is these kind of like nuclear imaginaries. Like, we have an imagined past, which is also only going to hamper these efforts, because sometimes that's a little bit divorced from reality. You know, even the idea of like make America great again, like what are we referring back to in this kind of imagined past, which I think is an interesting question. It's obviously a difficulty. I mean, that's going to be something like automation bias. Humans are just plagued with all these biases that make us not rational actors, and will impede our efforts to do empirical research, especially when that empirical research relies on, in my case, the opinions of experts who are themselves not rational beings necessarily. They're just doing the best they can with the information they have available to them. So I think maybe all we can really do is acknowledge that that's going to be a huge limitation, and try and work past these, and try and follow the data and the like logical outcomes in some ways as much as we can, while still acknowledging that, you know, nothing about this is fully objective. Sometimes people call my research quantitative research, and I just think that that's lovely and flattering, but a gross mischaracterization in some ways, because it is so inherently both qualitative and quantitative in the way that this research is set up, in the assumptions that are made about the world, in the people that I have engaging with it. And so while there may be a quantitative element of scores are numbers and I put them into a machine learning algorithm, that doesn't mean that it's objective. Something that I try and kind of emphasize as often as I can. I think it's a good question. I don't have the answer to it. I think it's something that we're going to have to continue to work
we
with.
have a couple of questions coming in. One is from Paul Ingram, and he's talking about the oceans becoming more transparent, and potentially with these new technologies and the submarines no longer being able to have the sanctuary there. And this is also one of the vulnerabilities that has been pointed out with the Poseidon, that if the launch submarine can be detected, then one can destroy it. So who would like to respond to Paul Ingram's question there?
Funnily enough, Paul might actually be one of the best people to answer his own question, because I know he's written quite a lot on this. But I suppose just to summarize, it is probably getting easier to track some submarines in some contexts. It is different for different actors for reasons of the stealthiness, the technology, where they're deployed. It is also because of different capabilities, different actors in terms of tracking. And really what we're talking about with this is the ability of the US and possibly some, in coordination with some allies, to track adversary submarines. I don't think the same quite applies the other way around. But I mean, and also the fact that, I mean, I've spoken to people about this, that they always remind me that the oceans are very, very big. Albeit submarines are limited to some extent, well, SSBNs are limited to some extent by where it's been mapped, where they can go, and ranges of missiles and stuff. But I don't think there's a massive breakthrough anytime soon. However, technologies are improving that will make it easier to find things underwater. It may not happen overnight, but it will increasingly, for example, for UK planners, it's something that has to constantly be kept in mind. If you're going to rely on just one type of system, you have to be pretty certain that there is no way of that submarine being found and compromised.
Yeah, so all submarines they give off this luminescence, which can be picked up by a satellite or an anti-submarine warfare aircraft. And so normally submarines hide in this area called the thermocline, which is the intersection between warm water and cold water, because there the signal gets fudged. But while sort of doing some research for this discussion, there is some discussion that with this AI and the algorithms, they might be able to break through this and compute the possibility of a submarine hiding in a particular place. And for the Russians, their big sanctuary is the Arctic. That's where most of their ballistic missile submarines are based. And in a war, not many would be flushed out. They would fire from on station. And then you have this Greenland, Iceland, UK gap through which the Russian submarines might come down and Western submarines might go up. So there is some interesting work going on in this area that I think Paul and others could look into. So we are now pretty much at the end. So could I invite final comments, and we'll go in reverse order, and Andrew, Marina, and then Elke.
I'm not sure I've got anything particularly wonderful to say, but just to thank the organisers again and thank my two excellent panelists. It's always great to hear both of them, and of course to you, Tarek, as well, and to learn and think about. I think there are a lot of questions that we're all trying to seek to answer, and I think events like this really serve to help us move towards that. Any article or book you might like to plug? Oh, I could. Well, if you'd have given me some, I could have put some stuff. But there's an article recently out called "Strategic Non-Nuclear Weapons and the Onset of a Third Nuclear Age," and that's kind of by you. Yeah, myself and Ben Zala. Yes. Yeah, that might be that people may be interested. Thank you. Same to Marina. Some last words, and if you'd like to plug something you've written in addition to Weapons of Mass Distortion.
Thank you. Yeah, I also don't have any kind of big grand concluding remarks. I think it's worth something that we didn't talk about in this session is to what extent is strategic stability as a concept still conceptually useful. This is a concept with Cold War, which reflects the Cold War dynamic, and it's something that we're trying to pull and push into the kind of 21st century. But we've got all these disruptive technologies, new actors, increased complexity. To what extent is this concept still useful? And maybe the answer to that is we don't know, but it's useful enough for our purposes, and that would also be an acceptable answer. But yeah, I guess from my perspective, thank you so much for having me. I don't have anything big to plug. We have the kind of next generation of this stream project coming out. It's a bit more ambitious. It's coming out under IFSH's kind of header, so you can look out for that in the future. And yeah, thank you to my co-panelists. Okay. Finally, Elke, I like your title of your book, Death Machines. It's actually quite catching and to the point. And I should have mentioned this earlier, but if you wanted to say something about laws, lethal autonomous weapons, and the other convention and certain conventional weapons under which some of these autonomous systems are being discussed, and some of the problems that we are facing in getting the technology possessors to agree on some limitations.
Thank you. Thanks for that plug for my book as well. It also has a really cool cover, which I don't have it here, but it's an image of a skull. Lethal autonomous weapon systems, I think it's a really interesting debate that's happening at the moment with the group of experts at the CCW, and some of these finer nuances about automation bias, about the epistemological issues, about the decision time compression, about the risks. On the other side, also the benefits are kind of disentangled at the moment and this week in Geneva. So I encourage everybody to kind of just watch the debates to better understand if you want to kind of have a bit of an in of what the pressing issues are. I've written in the last year or so 4 articles on it, published in various outlets that kind of problematize this question of meaningful human control. And here we're not just talking about fully autonomous lethal weapon systems, but also systems that are in AI enabled and where the human is an element in the systemic chain, if you will, kind of like almost like a .exec file. And yeah, the point that Marina highlighted, the question of what can be controlled or how human are these acts. So there's too many titles to mention them now, but you know, they're all on my various websites, so you can check them out. It's an important debate and it's an important question of regulation. And I think I just want to leave it here and thank you, of course, for the invitation. It was wonderful to see everyone and speak with my fellow panelists. And I think I want to kind of end with a question that Marina actually raised about the future or predicting or projecting the future. And I think we could do with a little bit more imagination and thinking through the futures we want to have. I'll leave it here.
So we sort of discussed some of the scary aspects of these new technologies and AI, but there are also some good aspects when it comes to things like verification and implementation of safeguards. So at the IAEA, they're using some of these intelligent technologies to do monitoring, counting of fuel rods at the bottom of a cooling pool to measure the Cherenkov glow, and also use certain instruments which can reduce the radiation danger to inspectors. And so here, there's a positive use of AI and autonomous systems. Our technician informed us that there, unfortunately, were some problems for some of the participants to log in. So we apologize for that. And I would now like to take this opportunity to thank each of you for this very interesting discussion. I learned a lot, and I'm sure the other participants learned a lot as well. And for the final word, I will pass it back to Claudia Crawford of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation.
Yeah, thank you, Tarek. You summarized everything already brilliantly, so that I don't have to add so much, except to give a big thank to all of our speakers, to Elke, to Marina, to Andrew, for this very interesting insight into the complexity of the challenges facing through disruptive technology and the impact on strategic stability. So you have shared with us an important overview and a very complex picture with key background information and a lot of food for thought we should be further elaborate. And allow me really to give a special thank to Tarek for this brilliant moderation on this highly complex topic. I think it is essential to provide a platform for dialogue. We have been reminded of the importance to share knowledge, to learn from each other, to take a glance into the future. Therefore, also a big thank to our audience from around the world for your interest. As said, you will find the recording of this discussion in our YouTube channel and the homepage of Atomic Report, especially against the background that we had some technical problems. So therefore, everybody who's interested can have a look afterwards. Our next online briefing, again in cooperation with Atomic Reporters, will take place on the 27th of October at the same time as today on the future on the non-proliferation treaty after 50 years. So I wish you all till then a good time. Thank all of you again. Keep safe and goodbye.